I still remember my first roller coaster ride. Now, roller coasters have gotten way bigger and way faster since when I took that first ride, but still, a 95-foot straight drop, which seems pretty tame by today's standards, for a first ride, that was still scary enough. I didn't really know what to expect because I'd never been on a roller coaster before. I just knew for this first ride, I wanted to be in the front seat because I wanted to take everything in, take in the whole experience, see everything that was going on. And as we're climbing up that hill and I got to the top and I'm looking out and I'm seeing all over the countryside, I'm like, wow, this is great. And then all of a sudden there was this jolt as some sort of mechanical, electronic, whatever, just shot the roller coaster car forward. And suddenly I was out and seeing nothing but sky, and then zoom straight down as my stomach is at the top of the roller coaster still, and I am hurtling down that 95-foot vertical drop towards what I was sure at that point was going to be, we're going to go splat right into the bottom. Now, made it through that alive, then zoomed around what I remember were some pretty big loops and some more ups and downs, and finally just coasted into the station, and I'm like, I was hooked. It's like, man, do that again. That was fun. And I did that for a lot of years till I got too old and my brain had been rattled around too much that I just couldn't take any of those thrill rides too much anymore. So now I leave it to younger people who can take it. Now, what in the world does any of this have to do with Bible? Well, I think that faith is a lot like that roller coaster ride. We'd like to think that faith, our faith life, our faith journey should be sort of like some smooth, stable ride, but most of the time it's not like that, is it? I mean, in most people's faith life, there's lots of highs and lows and ups and downs and twists and turns and constantly changing conditions, and some places where you don't even know which way is up. There are places where you feel really uncomfortable. There are even some places of sheer terror and uncertainty, and you can't help but asking yourself, why in the world did I get on this ride? I mean, you'd really like to think faith life would and should be different than that, right? But if your reality is like mine, roller coaster is a much more apt description, isn't it? And that was, by the way, for a guy whose story we're going to look at today, too. A man by the name of Abraham. Abraham's story is recorded for us in the book of Genesis, starting at chapter 12. Let's dig into that right now. We're going to dig into quite a bit of his story to see if he can teach us some things that can help us survive the ride for these ups and downs. Listen.
The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord.
So I'm listening to that and I'm thinking, what a start to the ride. I mean, what a high point. God called and Abraham obeyed. At 75, 75, Abraham just picks up and leaves his family, his country, his friends, and a lot of his stuff behind for some vague promise of a land I will show you. I mean, what kind of GPS coordinates do you put in for a land I will show you? And he gets this promise from a God that he's probably never even met before until this moment. And he may have some questions, although none are recorded here. But the bottom line is, Abraham heard God, and he believed God, and he did what God said. Now, maybe part of that's the promise of a child. I mean, at this point, Abraham and Sarah had none, and they're not getting any younger, so maybe Abraham reasons this promise of a child is worth taking a risk on. But still, he's 75, right? And the older you get, the more you seem to get set in your ways, and the less and less you like change. So even for a promise of a kid, leaving his family and all his stuff and everything he's known behind, leaving is a big step for Abraham, and yet he does it. A high point of faith, wouldn't you agree? And so the ride begins. Abraham arrives in Canaan, and God says, Abraham, this is the place. This is the place. And to thank God for what he's done so far, Abraham then builds an altar and worships and sacrifices, and that's the right thing to do. And so far, you're reading along and you're saying this ride's pretty smooth. And so you're kind of expecting at this point to read something along the lines of, and they settled down, and they had a child, and they grew and prospered and lived happily ever after, right? That's the way you'd probably write the story. But then you read verse 9. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. All right, he'd arrived, and God said, this is the place. And then God says, continue. Right? And to Abraham's credit, once again, he believed and he listened and he obeyed. Another high point until the dips started coming. Right? There's a famine in the land. And so Abraham leaves the land that God had brought him to and heads in the opposite direction toward Egypt, which was the very wrong direction from the land that God had said, well, this is yours. And then when he gets to Egypt, instead of trusting God to keep him safe, he pawns off his wife as his sister, and Pharaoh takes his wife into his own house, and God let him know that he wasn't happy with that at all. He let Abraham and Pharaoh both know that. And then eventually they head back to Canaan again, but back in Canaan, Abraham and Lot have conflicts, mostly over land and grazing and space. And, well, at least Abraham's faith has grown a little bit through this. And instead of insisting on his rights as the head of the clan to choose the best land, Abraham has the humility and the trust in God to say, well, God's going to provide. And he lets Lot choose the way. And he trusts that God will take care of him for treating Lot in a godly way. But, again, Abraham's faith isn't perfect. All right? And it's been years now since Abraham has left home. And although he's prospered and things have gone pretty well, the things that really matter to him, the land and a child, those things are still just a promise, still just words and nothing more. And so as chapter 15 opens, Abraham's starting to get scared. Abraham, who's seen as this great man of faith, is doubting and afraid. And I think what he's afraid of most is that he thinks maybe God isn't going to be keeping his promise after all. And so Abraham starts to suggest, hey, maybe let's help God along. I'm reading now from chapter 15, verse 2. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus. It's like, okay, God, I've got no kids still, even though you made this promise. So let's let my servant be my heir. That'll work, right? I mean, a lot of people do that. And it would fulfill kind of the intent of the promise, wouldn't it? I'd have an heir. He'd take my name. Remember, God, I'm not getting younger here, so let's get it done. Let's get it done now. Culturally acceptable? Yeah, happen a lot. Right? No. Because God had made a promise to Abraham, not to Eleazar, and that promise implied that Abraham was going to have a child and be a great nation, not Eleazar. And it implied that Abraham's child was going to come from himself, not some like legal designee that he had. Abraham's faith is kind of all over on this roller coaster. So you know what God does? God gives Abram a booster shot. He gives him a booster shot by repeating the promise again. And if I'm counting through from chapter 12 here to chapter 15, this is like the fourth time already that God's repeating the promise. Let me read it to you. Verse 4 and 5 of chapter 15. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Then he took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. So there's that booster shot of the promise. Okay, and in response to the promise, you know what happens? Abraham's faith is boosted and he's on the up part of that roller coaster again. Very next sentence, verse 6, Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. But you know what happens then? His faith takes another dip, and really pretty quickly. Because as God had told him, you're going to have a flesh and blood son, then he also repeated the promise of the land again. But then as he does that, Abraham actually asks for proof that God's going to do what he says. Very next sentence, verse 8. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? To which God responds, again with sort of like another booster, a visible sign. A visible sign, sort of a covenant ceremony like people in the day would do at the time to seal promises that they made with each other. Except in this covenant ceremony, God says, I'm going to obligate myself to this. I'm going to obligate myself to do this and to complete these promises for you, whether or not you do anything at all. And you'd think then that booster would have done it. Not. I mean, you turn the page to chapter 16, and what you find in chapter 16 is this is now 10 years after the initial promise. And Abraham's now 85, and he's still got no land, and he's still got no kids, and he and Sarah aren't getting any younger. And so Sarah, his wife, comes up with another idea to help God along with this promise. Okay, Abram, well, God said we're going to have kids, right? But I'm obviously not able to do that. So let's help God along. Abram, why don't you take my servant girl and have a kid with her? She'll kind of be like my surrogate, and you'll have a natural child, just like God said, Abram. And we'll say, hey, that's good enough. And Abraham went right along with that one. Now, culturally acceptable? Again, yeah, that happened a lot. Right? No. That's not what God wanted to happen. A child was born, but not the child of the promise. And actually, in this case, taking matters into their own hands to try to help God along, instead of just trusting that God was going to do exactly what he said, well, that ended up creating all sorts of problems down the road. Another low point in Abram's faith journey and another low point actually in Abraham's obedience. But God's not finished with Abraham yet, any more than he's finished with any of us. And I think maybe that's why God had Abram's journey written down, because we can relate to it. I mean, think about this. When you ask God for stuff, you want answers, right? Like right away, correct? And when there's a little or a lot of waiting involved, that's hard. And maybe it sends you into one of those low points too. Roller coaster, right? You have faith, or you wouldn't ask God, but the longer the answer you want is in coming, the more your faith is tested, right? And the longer and longer and longer the wait goes on, the more questions you have, and the more likely it is that your faith starts to waver a bit, because Satan, that master spinmeister, is spinning in all sorts of doubts and questions in your mind, and you're heading toward one of those low spots again. I mean, before we move on in this conversation, just stop and think about that for a minute. How that's been working in your own life. Where does God seem to be slow in his timing for you? And how's that affecting your faith? Go ahead and think about that, or if you're watching or reading or listening with somebody, go ahead and talk about that again right now. It's challenging, isn't it, when God seems to be kind of slow in his timing? And especially when you're in one of those low spots that seems to be going on forever. But here's the truth about roller coaster rides. Right? Low spots are there, but low spots don't last forever. And when you jump ahead to chapter 17, now you see that Abraham's 99. Now this is 24 years after God first made the promise to Abraham. 24 years after Abraham took him up on it. 24 years, a generation. And after 24 years, there's still no permanent place in the land, and even more important from Abraham's perspective, there's still no child. And in 24 years, that is a long time to wait on a promise. But it's just the right time, as far as God's concerned. And so in chapter 17, God shows up again and repeats the promise to Abram again. And this is number 5 by my count that he's repeating the promise. And after 24 years, he repeats this promise again. And Abraham is a little skeptical. I'm going to take you down to 17, verse 17. He laughed as he thought to himself, can a son be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, have a child? Then Abraham said to God, why not let Ishmael be my heir? Abraham laughs at God and asks God to reconsider the plan again. And if it's not Eliezer, maybe take that son he had with the servant girl. And this is not exactly Abraham's finest moment, but God always keeps his word. God always keeps his word. And so in chapter 18, what happens is God shows up again. This is pretty close in time frame now. He shows up again and he makes the promise again. This is time number 6 by my count. And this time he gives a specific time frame to the promise. Let me read it to you. The Lord said, I promise I'll come back to you next year at this time, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Next year. This is going to be happening in this short time frame now. And you know what? Sarah laughs too. Sarah laughs too. But do you think that's going to stop God? No, because God always keeps his promises. God always keeps his promises. And you know what? Sarah did become pregnant. And chapter 21, the child's born as promised and named Isaac, which means laughter, which sort of ends up being a living object lesson for both Abraham and Sarah, that God's going to do what he says, even when we laugh at his methods or his timing. And the beginning of the promise was fulfilled. Now, one child doesn't a nation make, nor does setting up a tent in the same spot year after year the same as owning the land. But the first step comes before the next step. And the next step comes before the step after that. And God's plan here is unfolding. All right, it's unfolding one step at a time. So while Abraham himself didn't really ever see all that God had promised, he didn't see the whole great nation or the whole land being his, he did see enough. He did see enough here in the birth of the child to believe that God was going to keep the rest of the promise. And why is that? Well, God had just done the improbable. You might even say the impossible. And what's one more improbable or impossible thing after that? Like God himself had said to Abraham and Sarah. Let me read it for you. Chapter 18, verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now again, I want to connect that with our own lives here for a minute. So before we move on in this conversation, again, hit pause and just reflect on this and talk about it if you're listening with someone or watching with someone. Where do you find yourself laughing at God? And where are you struggling to see the next step right now? Go ahead and hit pause and talk about that. So what gets you through those moments when you're struggling to see the next step? In a word, faith. So let's look at what this part of Abram's story shows us about faith. The first thing I see is you read Abram's story and you get a realistic, not an idealized picture of faith life. I mean, what Abraham's story reminds me is that faith life is that roller coaster. And our faith goes up and down, and our obedience goes up and down too. And you know what? It's important to understand that, I think. Because Satan's going to come in those low points, and he's going to try to get you both to doubt yourself. He's going to try to get you eventually to give up on God. And when that happens, you can remember that Abraham, one of those that we classify as these heroes of faith, that he had times like that too. Times when doubt was high and obedience was low, and he didn't understand God's timing, and yet he didn't let that make him give up on God. And you don't have to either. Right. Second thing I notice here about faith is that even though we know God's promises, we actually need to hear God's promises repeated, and repeated often. I mean, and it's that kind of repetition of the promise that actually helps us take the right action, even when we're kind of questioning. Remember how many times God repeated the promise to Abraham? It was in those questioning and doubting and wondering times, those low points, those places when he was afraid. And see, God did that because he knows that it's remembering the promise that's going to help you keep going. It's going to help you keep going just when you feel like giving up or walking away. So when you're most confused by life, go back to the Word. When you're most confused by life, go back to the Word so you can remember again what God has promised. And then number 3, I notice this, that faith can actually grow through the ups and downs. I mean, waiting 25 years for a son was not an easy thing for Abraham to do. Sometimes it was downright frustrating. But it was also necessary for God's plan and for God's purposes, and for God's plan and purposes for Abraham. And I think it was even necessary perhaps for what God needed to do and how he needed to grow Abram's faith, not for the moment, but for what was coming later, so that he could develop this sort of faith and trust that he was going to need for the challenges later in life, like the stuff that happens in chapter 22 of Genesis. I mean, I know it's worked that way in my life too. I'm just thinking back to these last couple of years of COVID, and I'm looking at things earlier in my life that actually helped to grow my faith, that I believe probably helped me as a leader in COVID time, just like be able to say, no, God's got this. We're going to make it through. And again, I want to take a couple minutes to connect that to your own story. So just again, hit pause, stop and reflect, and think about, have you experienced something similar? Take a moment to stop and reflect on some of the specific ups and downs of your own faith life that you can see have now helped your faith to grow stronger. Go ahead and do that right now. Yes, this story shows us a lot about faith, doesn't it? And that's important. But I think what's even more important is what it shows us about God. And here's the big idea, that God always keeps his word. It might look improbable, it might look impossible, but God always keeps his word. You see that in the story of Abraham. And if you look closely, you'll also see that in the story of your own life. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're in one of those waiting times or low spots that it's easy. It's not. Right? But it does mean that when you're in one of those waiting times or low spots, that you don't have to lose hope. In fact, you can wait with hope because you know what God's done before, and you know that he can do it again. God always keeps his promises, and even our unfaithfulness can't mess that one up. But there's even more. I mean, the story of Abraham also shows me this. It shows me that God loves imperfect people, and God chooses imperfect people, and God uses imperfect people, and God works with imperfect people like Abraham and like me. I mean, even our unfaithfulness can't negate God's faithfulness. Yeah, let me say that. I want to say that differently. Let's just redo that one. Basically, because I have a blank there that says faithlessness on my listener guide that I haven't sent to you. All right, it's early enough in.
Yeah, I'd say okay.
Yeah, this story of Abraham shows us a lot about faith, doesn't it? And that's important. But I think what's even more important in Abraham's story is what it shows us about God. And here's the big idea, the overarching thing that it shows us, and that's that God always keeps his promises. It might look improbable, it might look impossible, but God always keeps his word to us. You can see that in the life of Abraham, and you can see that in your own life if you look at it. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're in one of those, what I'll call waiting times or low spots, that it's easy. It's not. But it does mean that when you're in one of those waiting times, you don't have to lose hope. In fact, you can wait with hope in those low spots or waiting times. You can wait with hope, knowing that God, what he's done before, that he'll do it again. And that he can do it again. God always keeps his promises. Even our unfaithfulness can't mess that one up. But here's some other things that I also see in this story of Abraham. I see that that God actually loves imperfect people and that he chooses imperfect people and that he works with imperfect people like Abraham and like me. I mean, understand this. Even our faithlessness can't undo God's faithfulness. So if you blow it, if you lose hope, if you feel stuck in one of those low spots, if you lose trust, if you start thinking that maybe God can't do it, you're in the same place that Abraham was some of the time. And still, Isaac was born, right? Isaac was born because God loves, God chooses, God uses imperfect people to carry out his plans and his purposes. I also noticed this, that God takes you where you are. God takes you where you are so he can help you take the next step toward where he wants you to go. I mean, he takes you where your faith is right now, not where it's going to be, and then he helps you take that next step and the next step and the next step after that. And I also notice that, God can see farther than you can. All right? And God knows that sometimes, just like Abraham, what you're going through now is actually necessary so that you can survive what's coming later. I also see that God can and God will do both the improbable and even the impossible. I mean, is anything too hard for the Lord? I mean, you read Abraham's story and you have to come to the conclusion, well, no. There's nothing too hard for God to do or accomplish. God keeps all of his promises, even the impossible ones. And then there's this. Abraham's son, he was named Isaac. And Isaac means laughter. Now, when I've looked at that before, I've always thought that it's because Abraham and Sarah laughed at God's birth announcement and they needed some kind of object lesson or reminder of that, and that's true. But I started thinking about this. Perhaps at a deeper level, the child's named Isaac, laughter, for what I'd call the chuckle of God. The chuckle of God at our reactions about what's in front of us. I mean, when we're in one of those low spots or seemingly improbable or impossible situations and we cry or scream or shout, and it can't be, I think God chuckles. He laughs. He says, have you forgotten who I am? Have you forgotten what I've done? Have you forgotten how I've always kept my word and my promises? Have you forgotten what those promises are? Have you forgotten how deeply, deeply, deeply I love you? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And I think God laughs when we find ourselves saying yes to that one, because he knows who he is, and he knows what he's done, and he knows what he will do, all because he loves us and cares for us and plans on keeping his word. Need more proof? Well, many, many, many years after Isaac, there was another child who was born, this time to a virgin. That's not just improbable, that's impossible. But God made it happen anyway, because nothing is impossible for God. And so, God came to us. And Jesus was born to a virgin named Mary. And Jesus would do the thing for us that we needed most. He would reconnect us to God by taking our sin and our shame and carrying it to a cross. And even though he died, he didn't stay dead. That's impossible too, right? But it happened. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? You know, when you're struggling with the ups and downs of life and the twists and turns and the frequent, what I'll call discombobulations, when it's hard for you to see where God's way ends up, when success or blessing isn't coming for you as quickly or as timely as you think that it should, well, what God invites you to do is to get back into the story of Abraham and Isaac and lean into what I'll call God's laughter. And to remember in the story of Abraham and Isaac that nothing is impossible for God and nothing's too hard for him to do. Is anything too hard for the Lord? When you're starting to think that maybe it is, well, don't give up or give in. Right? Keep pressing on and keep pushing through as you lean into the promises of God and as you lean into the laughter of God. And as you do, you might even find a little laughter for yourself.